Thanks, Jessica, and want to thank everyone actually from PMI, Ken and Tom also, for supporting and operating these webinars. Really appreciate your support. It makes the whole training series possible. And thanks to everyone else for tuning in today. Today we'll discuss several aspects of communication that are crucial for optimal SAR team function at two distinct levels. And I hope to persuade you, first of all, that you're not as good at this as you think you are, and that you are the weakest link in this. You know, communication is something we rarely train for, but it's something that threads itself throughout everything else we do. And I've been thinking about this topic for at least 5 years. Partially I got thinking of it starting because of contemplating what makes a good SAR leader or a team member, and partially also by observing several incidents where communications either seriously or caused serious problems, or nearly caused serious problems, or failed to correct serious problems as quickly and smoothly as might otherwise have occurred. So let's begin. I've gathered a lot of research and ideas here, and I'm excited to share it with you. Excuse me. First of all, I'll tell you a little bit about myself in case establishing my credibility makes any difference. I've been with the Utah County Search and Rescue team since 1999, and I'll tell you, this county is an ideal place to be on search and rescue. We have incredible terrain with a 150 square mile lake, 7,000 foot mountains that reach nearly 12,000 feet above sea level, over 500,000 residents, which translates into about 100 rescue missions per year, so we're fairly busy. And I dare say we have one of the world's premier search and rescue teams. We've got about 50 excellent volunteers. We train hard. We work together very well. We enjoy incredible support from our sheriff department, and I hope that you all feel the exact same way about your team. Technically, I've been a member of the MRA for all that time as well, but I got involved with it at the regional level 7 years ago, and earlier this year we formed this Webinar Training Committee for two reasons. First, to reach out to more MRA members, so thanks to anyone who forwards our monthly invitations to your teammates who aren't signed up on the email lister. And if you're not on the lister, ask someone on your team how to sign up, because it's nice to be in the loop. And secondly, we created this series to share the wealth of expertise that our teams collectively possess. We've had some great presentations so far and gotten a lot of good feedback, and we need more presenters too. So if you have some expertise that you're willing to share with the wider rescue community, then please let me know. Regarding communication, I've got a master's degree in English, and with my bachelor's degree also 3 of my 6 minors were foreign languages plus linguistics and political science and honors, and I've lived abroad for 5 years in South and Central America, Europe and Asia, and I have to say I'm extremely impressed by how well those people have mastered those foreign languages. I've taught University of Strategic Writing for 15 years, and by strategic, I mean that I taught a strong focus on audience and techniques to make sure that the message comes through as effectively as possible. And during that time, I've probably graded enough papers to fill the room I'm sitting in right now, at least if you print them out with large enough fonts and wide margin and all those student tricks that you probably remember. Anyway, that means I've had plenty of time to practice focusing on every nuance and effect of every sentence, and with that level of scrutiny and awareness, sometimes I get to admire the way skillful communication makes things work magnificently. And other times I get to observe how quickly poor communication can make things fall apart. I've written several books, which you can find on Amazon, including 75 search and rescue stories, which covers the most memorable rescues from my first 12 years on the team, some of which I'll share briefly today during the presentation. And you should definitely order multiple copies as soon as the webinar ends. All right, let's get on with things then. Remember how I told you a minute ago that you're probably not as good of a communicator as you thought? Like, won't take that back yet. But I will point out that it's not really your fault. It's mostly your brain's fault and the fault of language itself. And here's why. Language by nature is crude. By that I don't mean to criticize your sense of humor. I mean that words are an imprecise instrument. However, that very imprecision also makes it extremely efficient, and our brains love efficiency. So to illustrate this point, watch what happens when 3 simple shapes appear on the screen. So Right now, every single one of you has an intricate image in mind of a 4-footed furry animal. And I think that's amazing. Is that the most efficient thing you've ever seen, or what? Like, how did all that rich detail come from a single 3-letter word? The answer, of course, is that it didn't. Those 3 letters merely reference the database in your brain and display the information already stored there. This information stored is called context, and we'll discuss that more in a minute. The obvious problem with this efficient yet imprecise system is that none of the images in your minds right now match. Some of you are picturing a friendly golden retriever, while others are imagining aggressive little yappy purse pets. The only thing they all have in common is 4 legs, teeth, and slobber. In other words, language is often ambiguous. This is especially true in English, where one word can have multiple unrelated meanings, like all the homonyms for bow, or is it bow? Is this a ribbon, or does it shoot arrows? Is it the leading edge of a boat? Is it when you bend respectfully at the waist, or is it the sound that your dog makes? All these we kind of use one word for. And to add this confusion, we've got all the homophones, which are spelled differently but sound the same, and with that you've got a medical emergency in your hands, as using these incorrectly, even on Facebook, induces irregular breath sounds and apoplexy and pedantic grammar police. Next we have words with inherent ambiguity, like the word big. What does that even mean? A big rock, for example, might mean something that fills your entire hand, or it may refer to something larger than your car or house. Big doesn't mean anything until we compare it to something else. And it turns out that that's the way your brain is wired. It can't evaluate anything until it compares it to something else. Clever marketers take advantage of this fact of biology by doubling the price of an item, then offering it for 50% off. What a bargain, says your brain. I'll take 2. Luckily, being aware of these sales tricks can help you resist them and make better decisions, and I'm counting on awareness to make you better communicators as well. The next problem with language is that it's always a foreign language to your brain, that is. Of course, your conscious mind can speak English or whatever language, but when it's not slowing itself down to a crawl to accommodate your sluggish train of thought, it works in far more efficient ways, such as images and complex abstractions, which allow it to process a lot more data with a lot less effort. So every time you want to express an idea, your brain must first translate it into words. Do you remember that game you played as a kid called Telephone, where everyone would sit in a row or a circle and one person would whisper a message to the person sitting next to them, and that person then turned and passes the message along, and when it reaches the end of the row, the message was distorted beyond all recognition. In technical terms, this language is a lossy medium. It's worse than when you used to pirate VHS tapes and every copy looked worse than the last. So when people receive that message at the end, it might not be what you intended at all. I wish that were the end of language weaknesses, but there's one more. It's also very subjective. What this means is that you only experience your side of it, because unless you're psychic, you can't climb into the other person's brain to make sure you or they understood correctly. Anything you say sounds perfectly clear to you because you began with the clear idea in mind. When you're listening, no matter how badly you've mangled the message, if it makes sense to you, then you assume that you understood correctly. In other words, language is kind of like sex. I once built an online dating website, by the way, with my brother that allowed people to list their interests and proficiency at about 100 activities. And when we ran our reports and crunched the numbers, kissing was the #1 activity, and it only fell below watching movies and receiving massages in self-assessed skill level. In other words, everyone thought they were in the top 20th percentile in kissing, but that's mathematically impossible. And just like with communication, these people thought, well, that was good for me. How could it not have been good for you? And guess what? I've got some bad news. Statistically speaking, you're probably one of those people overestimating your communication skills. We'll find out for sure as soon as we review one last inherent weakness of language, and that is that miscommunication is self-perpetuating. In other words, as soon as you begin to misunderstand a message, that misunderstanding becomes the foundation of your context, and your brain tries to twist all new information to match that existing context. This is called confirmation bias, and it has 2 biological root causes. First, remember how the brain works by comparison? That applies here as well. For example, when you search for something, Your brain first visualizes an image of whatever you're looking for, and then it scans the data from your visual cortex and waits for a match. We take this ability for granted because the brain does it so well, but it's actually a very complex system that computer programmers have been largely unable to replicate. So when you first misunderstand something, your brain latches onto that idea and appends all new data and compares it to that error. The second biological cause that makes our brain so lazy is that reprocessing information all the time would take an enormous amount of effort and energy. This concept was described very eloquently in Lawrence Gonzalez's book, Deep Survival. In part 2 especially, he discusses how people get lost when they bend reality within their minds to match the mental maps of their flawed expectations. And this book is so extremely quotable, I won't even begin to try, but I highly recommend picking that up and reading it. Now let's quickly review a few accidents and other problems caused by weaknesses of communication to underscore the importance of clear communication. For the first one, let's go back to 1977. There was a bomb threat at the airport in Gran Canaria in Spain, and so they diverted several airplanes to the island of Tenerife instead, which taxed its abilities beyond normal capacity. Not only did they have to park several jets in the taxiway, but a dense fog settled in and just wiped out any visual abilities to see. And does this remind you of anything, by the way? It should remind you of the conditions where rescue teams often operate. High stress, complex, unusual circumstances, and high stakes with potential for catastrophic consequences from even the slightest error. And that is exactly what happened in Tenerife. The tower had no radar to see through the fog, forcing it to rely solely on radio traffic. And after several misunderstandings, a KLM 747 thought that it had clearance to take off while a Pan Am jet was taxiing across the other end of the runway. By the time KLM realized what was actually going on, it was too late to steer away. It tried to take off, and when the two jets collided, all 538 people aboard died. So ladies and gentlemen, we must take communication seriously, and we must practice good skills so when the real emergencies arrive, we don't deteriorate to the lowest level of training. Following this accident, the airline standardized some communications such as never saying the word takeoff except when giving permission to actually take off. On our teams, we do the same thing by standardizing commands for rope teams, for example, like when a pine tree goes tumbling down the mountainside, you never shout, "Conifer!" because for climbers and rescuers, nothing falls off a mountain except a rock or a rope, maybe ice. Hopefully none of our teams have experienced any casualties by miscommunication, but what about near misses? Got an example from my county when an adventure racer broke his shoulder on a steep mountainside. A fellow racer stopped to help him and dialed 911. We had teams marching up the canyon to locate them when the Good Samaritan called and mentioned that he had an emergency flare that might help. I was in the parking lot listening to one side of the conversation, and when we directed him to shoot the flare down canyon, I thought, yeah, that could be trouble. And sure enough, the man aimed the flare downward into the canyon and pulled the chain. What we meant for him to do, of course, was to aim the flare upward into the sky and westward toward us, but that's not what his mental map understood. So the fireball shot out of the flare and straight into a stand of dry pine trees. The difference between a near miss and the most urgently dangerous or tragic rescue mission my team has ever faced was that the flare did not stop on a pile of dry twigs, but bounced instead into a small creek and extinguished itself. Let me plug, by the way, here for a second, alpinenearmiss.org. Let me show you this webpage. You've probably heard of it. The MRA has supported them with grants in the past, and it's a place where, usually we only hear about the accidents, but when near misses happen, we miss the opportunity to learn from them. So here you can submit reports as anonymously as you want, and you can go and you can read them as well, and there's some quite interesting ones. So I recommend spending a little time there and submit stuff when you have some things that other people can learn from. All right, back to the presentation. See if you can, here's a more common example, which we've all experienced. And Computer back here. More common is not nearly so serious. For example, we had a boat engine that went out one Sunday night on Utah Lake. It's a 150 square mile lake. And so while we send out our watercraft to locate them in the dark, the RP phoned in a couple times with some helpful information. The first time he told us that he was directly below the moon. And he later called back with a little more specific information that he was directly below a passing airplane. And when we pointed out 3 aircraft above the lake and asked which one he was referring to, he just answered the first one. So after that, we just turned off the phone and found them the good old-fashioned way. So no harm done in that case, just a little bit of humor. And here's one that we've probably all experienced. Maybe you're looking up the mountainside trying to point, like, oh, I see the RPs, or I see the 1085s, they're right by that tree, and they point out, and we look up to look for that tree, and there are 1,000 trees on there. And so we can't see the tree for the forest. And the pointing finger is not much more helpful than big words. Let's try this one out. This is Stewart Falls, one of many scenic, beautiful waterfalls we have in our county. And 20 feet to the right of the falls. And also they were wearing red. So let's see if you can spot them in that picture. And I'll zoom out a little bit, see if it makes it any easier. The problem you're probably experiencing right now is the same one we had, because when they said the waterfall, our brains assumed they meant Stewart Falls, the giant, obvious one in the area, and not the smaller cascade in the upper left corner of this photo where they actually were. And of course, we can't forget about the one we all joke about when someone's guiding a helicopter in and they say, okay, the chopper is directly in front of me at my 12 o'clock, which obviously is not helpful at all. All right. Enough examples. Let's move on to some field communications solutions. The first solution is to be as specific, as unambiguous as possible, and provide specific details. Remember, people are not computers. Here's an example of giving directions. So let's say you want to guide someone in, tell them how to get somewhere. So you might tell them, take the 800 North exit and go east, and then turn left on Daniels Canyon Road. And it sounds clear enough, it's obvious, it's precise, but now compare this to a more detailed explanation of what's really going on. So take the 800 North exit and go east, and then you're going to go all the way across town, cross State Street, and then you're going to enter the canyon and go all the way through the canyon, and then you're going to pass the reservoir. And as you approach town, then just a block before Main Street, you're going to turn left onto Daniels Canyon Road. So there was a lot of more information in that second example. And the main difference between the two, the first one was precise, but people aren't computers. The second one built a mental map for the listener so they could sort of prepare and see it in their mind and match that up with reality as they went along. Here's a quick example to give listeners the importance of giving listeners mental maps. A couple was on a date this summer also, and they got ledged out up in the canyons nearby. And when they called in 911, we were able to get a ping that placed them on a steep mountainside near some very big cliffs. And so several of our teams started up and started hiking up that direction. And we all had now a mental map to work from. We had an image where we expected reality. We expected to find our 1085s, our victims. Once two teams had started up, someone on the trail actually spotted the people and called the teams back. They said, "You're going the wrong way," and he was right, and we kind of believed him. But the problem was, well, in the first case, we weren't sure he knew where we were going and if we were really going the wrong way. But in the second case, what we needed, not just to know that our map was wrong, we needed to have a new mental map. Our brains require this. As Gonzalez points out, the only time we feel lost is when we don't have a mental map to operate from. And that's where they actually were. They were a quarter mile up the canyon, a little further, and we went up and find them. By the way, and brought them down just fine. I don't want to tell you the end of the story because this is just a normal, kind of average, not exciting mission, but it turned into one of my favorites because what happens, we got up to them, we lowered them down the mountain on a rope just fine, got them on the trail. But but the part that I loved is that after we lowered the girl down, she told one of our rescuers, she said, "You guys arrived just in time. I was about to tell him I love him." So I think that's so funny. We saved her from whatever headache. But one of the points I want to make with that is that when we're in pressure situations, our brains function differently. We're not quite as alert. We don't process information as well. It distorts our reality just a little bit. We'll come back to that in a minute. All right, the next tip is to listen from the listener's perspective. Do this by creating a complete mental map for them and begin from their viewpoint. Like you'd never look up a mountain and say, "See that tree I hiked to last month?" if we don't have no idea where that tree, which tree it is. But we often do that. We say, "See that tree I'm looking at right now?" And we assume that they magically know which one we're talking about. So remember, if your mouth is moving, then it's your responsibility in this moment to communicate clearly, to build accurate mental maps, and do your best to prevent any possible misunderstanding. And if you're on ICS, if you're a team leader, and you have some information that you could convey to your team in order to help them build accurate maps, that'll help them make better decisions and feel more comfortable in the field, so I recommend that. All right, the next tip is if you are trying to describe where something is, a really useful thing is a URO, which of course is a unique reference object. And let's practice to illustrate this. So here's a mountain. Okay, see the cliff, and I kind of point. Obviously, this is not going to help at all because there are lots of cliffs. If I see this, say, see the tree or see the mountain peak, there are fewer mountain peaks, but it's really not helpful. So something unique, for example, is the canyon itself. And if you know which canyon it is, I could say, okay, see American Fork Canyon. Now that's something unique, and people will know exactly what that is, and they won't be confused. Other unique reference points are the private property signs. There's a normal black with orange one. There's a yellow one there. So I can't just say, see the private property sign, go straight up from there. I need to clarify which one it is that I'm talking about. Other things you can do, like if it all looks kind of the same and there's a bunch of mountain peaks, for example, you can say, okay, see the 3 mountain peaks, pick that one. So let me try describing something, and then we'll test me and see how accurately I describe this. So there's a cliff in this picture where about a year or 2 ago someone fell or jumped off. I'm not sure which. And we'll help bring them down. So start with American Fork Canyon, and I'll look on the right side and see kind of that face with all the trees on it, and right on the left of it there's a big cliff sort of vertically climbing up the ridge, and on the left of that ridge it's all in shadow. On the right side it's all in sun. Well, there's a cliff right along that ridge. Let's move to the next picture now and find out if I did a good job. So it's roughly at D2. It's a little bit up and left of the cross point with D2. So hopefully I did a good job and you're all looking at the right spot on there. And then as I made that, I made this little comic afterward. There he is on D2, as if we all had a grid in front of our eyes. But I realized after this, we really could use this if we wanted. We could look out your field of view and just count 5, start at the top left, count 5 across and 5 down, and we could get people in the, might be a little better than pointing fingers, who knows. Okay, next tip is to use specific distances. Humans are notoriously awful, by the way, at estimating distances, but it's better than nothing. So if you say, see that pine tree 20 feet below the cliff, it's much less ambiguous than just saying the pine tree below the cliff, because maybe another 40 feet down there are more pine trees, and it's just a little bit less clear. Next, check for comprehension and agreement. And check in as often as you need to. If it's important, then even you can make people repeat back the instructions, and when they do, listen for any possible error rather than letting confirmation bias distort your perception of what they're saying and misunderstanding them the way they may have misunderstood you. This is particularly helpful with brand new eager recruits. I remember as a newbie rushing off to fill my assignment and later realizing that none of us were really quite sure exactly what we were supposed to be doing. I also remember a few years ago a team being sent up a canyon with part of our litter, and they didn't call back to clarify until they had hiked for several miles up the wrong canyon, which split off near the mouth of the other one. So that's it for tips for clear communication. I've got a few other field communication ones to cover. And the first one is to speak up. So if you know something is going wrong, then other people need to know what you know. So you need to say so, and you need to say so loudly and clearly if necessary. You know, outsiders probably think, they probably have this impression that SAR teams are made up of all A-type adventurers, all bold and brash. But with all the teams I've known, that's really not my experience. I find most of us are team workers, team players who want to make an important contribution. And if you're one of those people without a strong take-charge personality, that's great, that's totally fine, but you must speak up when others need your knowledge. You know, if everyone was sitting around your living room, you could probably speak quietly and be heard just fine, but in an emergency situation, people don't listen carefully. They're busy doing and thinking other things, and they probably won't hear you if you don't help them out by speaking up. And remember that people who do speak up, studies show they're perceived as the leaders in a group, and their ideas are most often adopted, but that does not mean that their ideas are the best. So if you've got a better idea, don't be shy. Don't worry about stepping on anyone's toes by being more assertive either, because in the first place, that's better than anchor failure or whatever accidents you could maybe prevent. And in the second place, don't worry about speaking up to the people who do have the take charge, control freak kind of personalities, because that's actually their language, and they'll probably respect you for it. I remember learning this on a 5-week sailing trip adventure I took several years back when my friend Dan bought a $500,000 sailboat in Venezuela, and he asked who would help him sail it home. So naturally I said, a friend in need is a friend indeed. I quit my job and I met him in Aruba. And Dan's a great guy, but he has a flash temper and a sailor's mouth, and it took a couple weeks for us to kind of get used to that and learn and figure out the best way to respond to him, which was to just communicate with his communication style. So once when he was yelling at me to do something better, I just said, shut up, I'm doing a good job. He then quieted down and even apologized a few minutes later. And we got along great. Actually, got along great most of the time anyway. Okay, next one is say what you want. Say what you need, like the action that you need. And if I had a great singing voice, maybe I'd sing that song to you that repeats those two phrases over and over. A good example of this is yet another aircraft story. This time it's a Colombian jet flying to JFK, and they ran out of gas and crashed on Long Island because the pilots did not clearly state that they were nearly out of gas until it was too late. All but one crew member died and nearly half the passengers because they didn't clearly state what they needed. Just last week, a truck drove off the edge of a dirt road and bounced 600 feet down a steep mountainside till it stopped after knocking over a very large tree. The next day, somebody spotted their tracks and called us. So we brought our 600-foot ropes and used them, I think, for the first time. And I rappelled down the litter as soon as we had one fixed. And I posted a video of this, by the way, on rescueacademy.org.
Okay, so it's this one. All right.
The dog's on the first one we brought down.
Okay, great.
In the background, you can hear two people telling me that I was tying the wrong rope to the litter first, because they had brought down a second line after I came down, and I didn't get it because my mental map didn't include that rope. So instead of saying, don't use that rope, use the other one, which is what they wanted and what they needed, what they knew, they said things like, the other rope's the one we rappelled on first. And so logically, that was intended to make me understand that it was the one fixed the raising system and I should use it, but I didn't stop to process that information. It's kind of funny. I'm like, okay, great. I just go on doing what I'm doing. So I'm not blaming them, obviously, because if I had thought it through, it would have clicked. But being in an emergency situation, my listening abilities were inhibited, and so I failed on that one. Oh well. Yeah, I'm sure if it had been a more critical situation, they would have done exactly that. They would have been able to stop. And we figured it out easily enough right away anyway afterward. Okay, next tip is use polite words. And this is the lesson I learned from my SAR mentor, Chris Johnson, and that's that when you're in a tense situation, polite, professional words grease the wheels and calm nerves and So saying please and thanks and good job, it goes a long ways in those instances. And I had two of my very favorite calls ever are great illustrations from this. They're both difficult and technical and taxing, and you're understaffed, and we did a great job. But here's the stories. First one is in the upper left corner of this picture one spring. This is later with a little bit less snow on the ground. But there was a guy who was about 6'8" and 350 pounds, and he stepped over a log and stepped through where the radiant heating had melted the snow away, and that caused him to fall forward, and then he slid 600 feet down a steep snowfield, then went over a cliff and landed in the moat below that. And he couldn't get out, but luckily a little girl hiking with her daddy a little ways away on the trail saw his hand waving just above the edge of the snow. So it took all night to get everyone up the mountain to him and raise him back up 600 feet to an LZ. We were undermanned. We had several other incidental technical challenges, including a 5-to-1 raising system with only a few people at the upper anchors, and one of our litter attendants got impatient and snippy. This attitude transferred to our patient, who, in the end, he was extremely grateful to us for saving his life, but he also joked several times about suing us since he nearly lost an arm because we didn't get him out a few hours more quickly. But we did a good job considering our resources. We did a great job. Anyway, 3 weeks later, we had a kid who was climbing in probably one of the most rugged areas of our county, Upper Falls, just cliff after cliff after cliff, with waterfalls all over. It's really beautiful, though. And he fell 50 feet, and he landed on his face, as you can kind of tell from this picture. I didn't even have to blur his face out because I don't think anybody's going to recognize him from that. Anyway, we spent all night lowering him over half a dozen waterfalls to a waiting ambulance. The first falls wasn't vertical, so we had 6 attendants kind of tied in and helping carry the litter down to the next station. We communicated extremely well, warning of each other of logs and such, and all that polite conversation. And when we reached the next station and set the litter down on the ground, I said something like, "Good work, everybody. That could not have possibly gone any better." And then from within the litter, our victim's muffled voice, we had him all packaged up, and his face was all messed up and everything. We heard his voice say, "I love you guys." And I just imagined that all of our positive communication made him feel so much more comfortable and secure while he was strapped tightly into the litter all night long. So that's it for field communication tips. Now let's move on to something even more subtle and at least equally important for different reasons, and that's team culture and how language supports and reinforces it. I love this topic. I think it's very important. I think it makes the difference between a good team and a great one. So every team has a culture, and it affects how your team functions, and it's reinforced by language. So to underscore that significance, ask yourself why your volunteers joined Search and Rescue in the first place. So this section is partly aimed at team leadership, but really anybody any team member can participate and help make this happen, help design your team the way you want. So for some people, they joined SAR because of the adventure. Though honestly, you could have a lot more adventure if you invested your time and energy and money elsewhere, right? For others, it's recognition, though it's hard to imagine that what little recognition we typically get could ever compensate for the effort it takes. And most of the posers I've seen who really just want to join SAR to get that cool sticker on their car, they tend to drop out within a few years at most. For some people, it's pro deal. But as we all know, the first rule of pro deal is don't talk about pro deal. So let's move on. Probably the greatest motivation we all share is to make a contribution to something greater than ourselves. And that's one of the central motivations that research has identified in recent decades, in general, especially for volunteerism. Other prime motivations revealed by research are mastery, meaning we want to do things well, and autonomy, meaning that we long to have a say in what we do and to have some ownership. And the final significant motivator that I've observed is relationships and a sense of belonging. So the point is to find out what motivates team members and make sure they get some of that. Because motivated team members invest more in the team. They train harder, which increases mastery, which increases motivation, confidence, team pride, and devotion. They respond to more rescue missions. They contribute and raise the operating standard of the entire team. And they stick around for decades instead of just months or years. So speaking to team leaders in particularly again, isn't this exactly what you want from your team? Isn't that how you get optimal performance from your volunteers? So this whole last segment of today's webinar will explore how you can use communication to make that happen. Now let's discuss a few aspects of your team culture and evaluate how well it currently supports these goals. In the first one, we're going to go back to another airplane story. If you read Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, by the way, then you know a couple of these stories. And you know about how Korean Air had more crashes for a period in the 90s than any other airline. And so when they investigated, they found the problem lay in the Korean culture itself. In some cases, the co-pilot knew exactly what was going on, like Flight 801 leaving for Guam in August of '97. And there was some confusion with the radar and stuff. And the co-pilot knew what was going on, and he hinted at it to the pilot. But out of respect for the senior pilot, he didn't speak up clearly, even when he knew, probably, that he was about to die along with everyone aboard his jet. So what about your team? And there it is. There's the crash site when it hit a mountaintop there, not too far from the airport. What about your team? Who holds the power, and how do they hold it? Sometimes everything looks just dandy from the top, but sometimes leaders forget to find out how things look to those with less power. So on your team, do all team members feel free to speak up? If you want them to, then you must foster a culture that supports it. 13 years ago, by the way, when I was just new on the team, my team had a little problem with this. Many team members saw ICS as somewhat authoritarian, and they didn't feel free to speak up. Well, my first assignment on the team was public information officer. I was 2 years in. So I built a web page, complete with our own private discussion forums, so we could advance good ideas in between trainings and meetings when we didn't have contact otherwise. You can probably imagine what happened next, as online forums are notorious for being our very worst manners. Even though I required everyone to use their real names in the forum, people spoke up there who hadn't been willing to speak up in a more intimidating face-to-face scenario, and a few of them became quite disrespectful and rude as they vented their pent-up frustrations. Frankly, the other side, our leadership, didn't handle the situation very strategically either. Sort of like King George before the American Revolution, they wanted the rank and file to get back in line, and the rank and file wanted to be heard, they wanted to be respected. And so our revolution continued for a few months. Once the situation finally got ironed out and calmed down, a few people's trust had been damaged, and it took a few years to really recover that. And I'm sure our brand new team members were a bit freaked out by the animosity that a few people were displaying. But in the end, our culture problem was resolved. And I think that ever since then, everyone has felt more respected and totally free to speak up as needed. And the one thing, of course, that could have prevented this incident entirely or smoothed it out more quickly once it began is respect. So ask yourself this: do you respect your teammates? You know, in marriages, as one social scientist has identified, contempt, which is the opposite of respect, is the biggest predictor of divorce. And our team memberships aren't so different. They're relationships, and the lack of respect takes a toll on them too. Second, let me point out that if you don't respect your teammates, then just like with clear communication, there's a 98% probability that it's your problem. I'm saying that in case no one else has pointed out to you already, and yes, I just make up that number, but it's still accurate. So what does respect look like on a search and rescue team? First, you must recognize team members' value and then acknowledge that value somehow. If a certain teammate is motivated by recognition, then you can acknowledge them publicly. And just as with clear communication in the field, be specific in your compliments, because that's worth a lot more than vague statements like, you guys are awesome, and thanks for all you do. There's nothing wrong with saying those things, but compare it to something more specific like, awesome job keeping the patient calm back there. And can't you instantly tell how much more meaningful that is and how much more supportive it is of the kind of behaviors that you want to emphasize and reward? I remember once when a kid got stuck in a tight cave passage in our county, and it took us a few hours to work him free, to weigh a little piece of rock and lift and twist and kind of finesse him out. And my teammate Dirk sat next to his head the whole time. We put some lights there and everything to make him feel better, but Dirk was so funny and so good at keeping this kid talking about positive things that the kid had absolutely no chance of panicking. And I was deeply impressed, and I hope I told Dirk so how impressed I was about what he did. I think I did. Anyway, words are cheap, so why not spend a few? All right, we're oops, I moved too soon. If you're so that covers if your teammates are motivated by recognition, and you can do it privately, or if they want public recognition, you can say those compliments in front of other people, and what is at the base of all these things I'm pointing out here about motivation is feelings. We're really driven by our feelings and by our limbic brain. That's where behavior is driven in our brains. It's the way we're wired. And so if you can create positive emotions that they associate with the team, that they associate with good behavior and performance and dedication and training, all that kind of stuff, then it'll reinforce doing those things on the team. So if you've got someone who's motivated by rewards, then buying the team lunch after a mission or a little piece of gear, it goes a long ways toward making them feel appreciated. If they're motivated by mastery, then maybe you can acknowledge their skills or preparation. If they're motivated by ownership and autonomy, then include them in the loop and share information about what's going on behind the scenes, and then listen to and consider their ideas. If you're not sure what motivates team members, don't worry, because most of us are actually motivated by some combination of all the above, and any acknowledgement at least shows that you noticed. Along with recognizing the good, consider how you deal with problems in order to make it as positive of an experience as possible. For example, it's important to point out areas for improvement, otherwise they may not improve. But unless it's a serious mistake that really needs to be addressed with some sharpness, then make it clear that errors are temporary and don't focus on them more than necessary. And one way to accomplish that is, like in a debriefing, for example, or conversation or whatever, you can ask the team member who made some error what they could have done better, and let them state it instead of you. And if they get it, if they know their error, then you can be totally positive. You can respond by accepting their analysis and saying something like, "Good point," or "That's true." So the next question is, exactly how positive should you be? Well, I'll tell you based on more research. You know, there's this whole idea that's been being studied for a few decades that involves the optimal positive to negative ratio in relationships and work and education and several scenarios. And researchers have determined that the optimal ratio is to have at least 5 or 6 positive interactions for each negative one. This results in better work and academic performance, and when marriages fall below this ratio, according to John Gottman, for example, they are destined for divorce. So a lot of people tend to believe that this number, this ratio, 5 to 1 at least, is hardwired into our brain. Sometimes we tend to focus on the negative because that's the squeaky wheel. You know, everything else is fine. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But I hope you wouldn't treat your car that way. You wouldn't, for example, let it run out of oil before you get an oil change, although I did hear someone who thought that was the appropriate thing to do the other day. If you do, of course, your car will fall apart. This is called a neutral approach, and at best, it's a missed opportunity. Business takes this research seriously when they want to improve outcomes, so why not search and rescue? Now, I imagine that there are some of you out there right now thinking, "Oh, come on, I'm not their mother. These are not children we're dealing with. Don't make me coddle them." And that's true. You have a point. You are not responsible for anyone's self-esteem. And I don't believe in the accommodating self-esteem culture either, in which everybody is a winner no matter what. But the research is real. And you can either implement it or you can ignore it and hope everyone, you know, performs well on their own, but that's not leadership. So if you're in a leadership position, consider stepping up. And if you refuse to implement because you're such a crusty old curmudgeon, then you must at least admit that at this point your personality is inhibiting your ability to be a more effective leader, and you're partially responsible if your team is not reaching an even higher degree of excellence. On the other hand, by the way, I mean, there's room for all personalities, and if you genuinely respect people, you can get away with being pretty curmudgeon-y. I remember my first SAR commanders were quite often abrupt and direct, but that often made directions and instructions even more precise and efficient. And because we knew they respected us, everyone seemed to take it just fine, not really mind too much. By the way, the original research that explored this whole optimal positive to negative ratio has been largely debunked because it used some fairly flawed research methods. But it took many years to realize that, and so in the meantime, numerous other studies have confirmed those numbers. In case you're wondering, educational research found that sending positive comments via email is more or less as effective as saying it face-to-face. And on that note, by the way, does your team have a convenient way to communicate electronically? When I set up our web page all those years ago, I also set up a bunch of email forwarders to our team so that we don't need to look up everyone's personal email address. You can send it kind of to their number at our team address, and some group alias, so you can send it to one address and it gets to the whole team, and it's really convenient. So I highly recommend doing something like that to increase and improve communication within your team if you don't have something like that works well for you already. Another important thing that research found is that it's ineffective to be too positive. So all those people who are like always cheery and smiling and positive and refuse to see anything negative, they've been feeling justified by everything I just said, you may need to calm down a little bit. Some studies put this, the highest number I've seen is 13 to 1. If you have more than 13 positive interchanges per one negative one, and negative doesn't have to be terrible, it could just be like, hey, here's room for improvement, then it becomes less effective, and I've seen numbers much lower, I think down to maybe 9 to 1. I couldn't find that number when I was just trying to look up research recently. So maybe too much positivity undermines the need for improvement. Maybe it's just not realistic and no one takes your compliments seriously anymore. Maybe it's like on The Matrix, where, remember when they said the early versions of the reality they had created where they didn't have any suffering and the human brain just could not accept that. Maybe it just doesn't fit into our brain. Maybe we're not wired for that much positiveness. Okay, moving on, next thing, let's talk just a little bit about humor. I just want to make one point about this. Humor is important, of course. It can add to that positive enjoyment that reinforces our motivations to be part of the team. And it can also help us cope psychologically with hard times, like Tom Wood pointed out in last month's webinar on dealing with suicide. It can be very important. But there is one type of humor that raises some red flags, and that is sarcasm. Sarcasm, by definition, is negative. It uses irony to mock or to communicate contempt. Sometimes it's also extremely hilarious and totally appropriate and awesome and a good thing, and some people are so good at it, and we love to be around them. But let me make a few points just to keep it in perspective. First off, if sarcasm is the dominant type of humor in your team culture, then there's a good chance that you've got some problems, some limiting factors in that could make your team even better. I remember, here's a personal experience. This is not exactly sarcasm, but focus on negative humor versus positive. For example, many years ago, 12 years ago I think, I went sailing and we had a great time, and then I tipped over my boat, and our 150,000 acre lake, by the way, is only 12 feet deep, and the mast on my sailboat was 26 feet high. So when it flipped, it jammed the mast into the mud really bad. It was an awesome storm. There were 2-foot waves blowing up with only less than half a mile of fetch of water for the wind to blow across. It was great, but it jammed in there so hard we just couldn't get out. So after I struggled with that for about half an hour, I finally pulled out my radio and asked if I got Kent on the line and said, hey, do you want to send a couple of wave runners out here just to help me pull this mast out of the mud? Of course, we never respond part way, and so the whole team came out, and it was a big deal. And overall, it was awesome. It was a very positive experience. My date was hilarious. Kent asked, he's like, hey, so you ever going to go out with Shaun again? And Amy said, I don't know about Shaun, but what about you? Want to go get lost? So it was pretty funny. But I'll tell you, I got teased so much for that if next time in trouble, I'm probably not going to call the team. I'm just going to work it out myself. We had another team member who broke a leg on a mountain. He walked off the mountain by himself rather than calling us. So I don't know. It doesn't sound quite optimal to me. And most people, they don't enjoy being the butt of the joke, at least not repeatedly all the time. Or at least if you don't average it out with more positive comments, like I said earlier, than negative. And here's the other thing about sarcasm. If anybody says, hey, you guys are being mean or whatever, what's the response that probably they get? They're like, oh, don't be a baby, you know, be tough, be strong, whatever. And the reality is that if you want to be tough and brave and a man or whatever, why don't you try being open and genuine and positive? That takes way more courage, and if you can't do that, then how tough are you really? Because vulnerability requires the truest courage of all. It doesn't allow you to hide behind facades. And hiding behind facades, that undermines you. You can't have really authentic relationships that can become one of the really motivating forces in search and rescue dedication. Now, that was a long time ago, too. I would not define my team that way at all right now. It's so positive. In fact, at our last meeting, some of the sheriff personnel, we've got 4 of them we're working with closely these days, and they're awesome. And they talked about how just working with us makes them happy to get out of bed in the morning. And I think we all feel the same way about them. So we have a really good team culture going on. All right. Anyway, so in summary on that point, negative humor is fine in moderation, but it should be earned. If you're genuine and have plenty of positive interaction with the teammates, then you can disregard this whole point. Now to kind of sum up, you know, throughout this webinar, I've been pointing out common communication weaknesses. I've been suggesting how to strengthen and repair them. And I've tried to convince you that you have room for improvement, and even if that's true, no matter what, the real truth is that you are a bunch of amazing volunteers, some of the best in the world. You consistently do spectacular work. You're all world class. And I'm pleased that I can be certain of that because of your MRA membership, because I know the MRA teams are focused on excellence. And I know that as you do your regional reaccreditations, that I'm sure you have great feedback and all that. So keep up the good work. And now that we've covered, obviously this is not a comprehensive list of all the communication tips and team culture, leadership tips. There are millions of them. If you want more, 2 books I recommend that I really didn't get into at all are Influencer is a pretty good book, and First Break All the Rules. I like that one by Mark Buckingham and somebody. But I hope that here in the end now that as you've listened to these tips that you've realized and you're more aware of the good things that you do, the things that you are so skilled at, the way you reinforce positively, the way you communicate clearly, you know, to avoid problems and mistakes like that. And I hope that's true. And so that you can say, you know, that you, the weakest link is not you. And if not, you know, if some of these things were new ideas to you, then I hope you try them out and make your communication skills as sharp as your technical, medical, search, and whatever other SAR skills you got. And that's all I've got. That's it. So I hope you found it useful. And Jessica, I guess we'll go to you for any questions.
All right. Thanks, Shaun. If anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and type them into your chat/questions area of your control panel. While I change the screen back over to mine. All right. Okay, so like I said, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat/questions area of the control panel. And so far there aren't any, so apparently you are an extremely good communicator, Shaun.
Let's hope that's the reason.
I'm sure it is. So I'm going to go ahead. We'll give you a few minutes to type in any questions that you do have. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of a wrap-up. But please feel free, if you do have questions, type them in while I'm wrapping this up. If you have any questions that we don't get to today or that you think of later that you would like to ask Shaun, you can email him at the address shown at the top of your screen.
And if you have any topics that you'd like to present, do the same thing. We'd love to have you.
Yes, we are always looking for presenters for these. The MRA Webinar Series hosts webinars frequently every month, so you can keep an eye on the MRA and PMI websites for the future dates and topics. And another great place to find out about the future dates and topics of these webinars, along with all other things regarding MRA and PMI, is to follow both on Facebook and Twitter. And you can see the addresses shown on your screen there. And we do have one question, and it was, how about cave rescue?
Okay, good question. Now, when you get into something like cave rescue, a lot of the communication challenges are technical ones, like getting radio communications through. What was our main cave until it closed a few years ago after you probably heard about the Nutty Putty tragedy on Thanksgiving. It had this long section, and we could actually get radio communication almost all the way through the most popular part of the cave. So you know, anyone who's into caving, you probably know these answers way better than me. But you can get some of like the military kind of communication boxes that have wired and then combined with radio and things to get through that. I'm just brainstorming on anything else I can say that applies specifically to that. It's also important, of course, if you have part of your team that's highly skilled and trained in caving and other parts that are less technically advanced in that area. If you know, the more training people have, when you say, I want to build a, see, here's this word, stunt, I can't even remember the word. It's a certain kind of anchor in there. If they understand what you're talking about, what those terms are, then it makes it easier to communicate. I'll keep thinking, and Jessica, feel free to interrupt me with another question.
Actually, this is kind of a perfect example of what you've been talking about. The person who asked the question just typed in another one and said I was actually talking about having a cave rescue webinar.
Oh, sorry about that. So obviously you're the person who knows all the answers to what I thought I was supposed to answer this now. I think that would be really cool because, like I said, there are so many, and I know it's advanced in recent years. They're coming up with better and better techniques, and old ones are outdated. And seeing all those techniques would be fantastic. So yeah, if you're expert at that, please get in touch. We'd love to do that.
Okay, and there is actually one other question. What do you do when the admin seems stuck on techniques and won't listen to new ideas?
Oh, that is a good question, and I really should have anticipated it. Luckily, with communication, now on one hand, the admin, the leadership, the people who have the positions, they exert so much influence, and so their role is extremely important. Maybe send them, make them watch this webinar or something like that. But the good thing about communication is everyone is involved in it, and so you can do a very positive coup, maybe you call it, at any level where you start complimenting people and you start building these positive relationships and let that percolate up through the team. I remember years ago, my friend Chris and I started our motorcycle team, our single track special team, and so as we got other guys on bikes and we'd ride and train, a lot together, we had such good rapport. It was so good that I heard through the grapevine there were people who were jealous of that. And so, but if you create that, it can help raise, it can change the culture of your team. It's harder when it's not the leader doing it from the top down, but you can still make a huge difference. And frankly, I'm not surprised by that because it's very logical to think about technique and to forget about the importance of communication, which really is so important.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question regarding motivations as to why people join SAR. Do you try to figure out why a newbie is joining to see if they're going to stick around? Teams invest lots of time in training people, and it can be disheartening when you have too many of them leave when their expectations aren't met.
Great question. Let me give a few answers to that. First off, I haven't found myself consciously questioning why each person joined, but I do catch myself observing what seems to motivate them, what they gravitate toward, and sometimes I find myself, playing to that a little bit just to encourage their enthusiasm for it. Other things that are important to do is to set proper expectations. When we have newbies come on, by the time they're starting training, by the time they're on the team, we've made it very clear, like, this is going to take a lot of time. We're a busy team, and we expect you to attend at least a third of the things. So we try and set those expectations right. And then another thing you can do is when their expectations don't get met, and I'm not sure, there are so many ways that can happen, is if you have good communication, you can really ameliorate those situations so much. Like if they feel like they're not being respected enough because they're a newbie, ask, say, hey, you don't seem very happy, what's going on? We haven't seen you call us for a little while. Is there anything you're not pleased with? Let them vent to you a little bit, and then if there's nothing you can do about it, then you can at least explain the situation and say, look, you're first year on the team. I know you have great technical skills, but nobody knows that yet, and so they need to get comfortable with you before we're giving you the big assignments, because people's lives are on the line and so forth. So communication can help that out. But if they expected something that is just unrealistic, there's not a whole lot you can do about that, except motivate them. Say here's reality. Don't you want to be a part of this too? So it's worth a try.
Okay, great, and that is all the questions we have. So we'll go ahead and close this up, and if you have any further questions, feel free to email Shaun. And we thank you for attending, and we hope it was helpful, and thanks, Shaun, for doing this.
You're welcome. Thanks, Jessica, and thanks, everyone.
Have a great day, everybody.